Welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Gabe Ignetti and our special guest, Rob Lewis, author, poet, activist, and he's written Climate According to Life Substack and a small collection of poems called The Silence of Vanishing Things. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Good to be here.
What's the gist of your article, Fast Tracking Permitting of Green Energy?
Things are going terribly. A recent report by NatureServe shows that we were on track to lose 38% of animals, 40% of ecosystems disappearing. And according to my just rough calculations, that's due mostly to land change, and we're looking at about 6,100 square kilometers of land change a year that is kind of behind that terrible decline. And then you have on the green energy side, the proposal to massively increase land conversion and habitat destruction for all this technology, which amounts to about fourfold that rate, or 24,000 square kilometers a year, or 675,000 square kilometers overall. So how's the land going to handle that? I don't think it can. And if we're already in a biodiversity crisis, then this seems to me to pretty much seal the deal on extinction in North America. So it's not a solution, in my opinion. If you have a heart and feeling for the natural world, that has to bother you. But the green energy community just doesn't seem to notice. They're so fixated on CO2, as if CO2 is the only cause of climate change. And that's one of the things I talk about in this paper or in this essay, is that science has known for decades that when we damage land, we also damage climate. We just do it differently. We damage water cycles, which are so responsible for cooling and moderating our climates. So by fixating solely on CO2, we're missing all these other things that are happening. And it's confusing people, and it's resulting in some very bad policies.
Yeah, this is not against green energy. And that's pretty clear. We're not against green energy as a solution. We're in favor of all climate solutions, of course. You sort of talked about, well, how is the land going to handle this massive change? So famously, hydropower has this complication where right after the dam goes up, there is a large amount of deteriorating greenery underneath that, and that can produce fugitive methane emissions. Is it, well, some kind of effluent methane emissions?
No, yeah.
And as well, solar panels, wind turbines mean that there's access roads and portions of forests taken out. What's the next step when you say, okay, we need a reform to permitting, or we need a second look at permitting? How do we know that we're going to be able to achieve our goals with the appropriate level of caution?
Okay, let me just clarify. You said I'm not opposed to green energy. That's not actually correct. I'm opposed to the scale of green energy that's being proposed. What I'm most opposed to with green energy is calling it green. We just need to call it new energy, next generation energy, whatever, but there's simply nothing even remotely green about it. And that would help clarify our thinking. And then what we leave out of the equation is the power of the biosphere to regulate its own climate. Most of the climates we experience in the places we live are a result of living processes between trees and soils in the atmosphere and water vapors that keep the climate cool and keep it moderated. And when we destroy those systems, we end up with heat. We end up with lots of weather extremes. So I think, when you say the next step, to me, the first next step is recognizing that we have a bicameral climate. We have a climate that is two things. There's this atmosphere that has been overloaded with carbon gases, and that is warming the atmosphere. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. And then a lot of that warming ends up in the oceans, which is quite terrifying when you look at the numbers. Okay, and that is happening from the atmospheric down. It's like a downward pointing arrow of causation. Well, there's an upward pointing arrow of causation, which is what the land provides. The land, in a sense, upholds this climate that we live in and kind of take for granted and think of as a machine when it's actually the production of a living system, the way clean water is a production of a living system. You have healthy landscapes, you have cool climates, depending on the locale, and you have moderated climates. So I think that's the first thing that needs to happen is the IPCC needs to explain itself. It needs to explain why it has left out this other side of the climate. And if you look at IPCC reports, you'll notice that all their assessment reports are amended by the term the physical science basis. And when I discovered that, that was a real clue for me. But interestingly, no climate journalists seem to have noticed it or have made much of it. But what it means is the IPCC takes this physical science basis. So it's basically the physics of climate. And the reason they look at the physics is because by turning it into numbers, which you can feed into computers, they can at least provide the basis for some sort of proof and some sort of prediction. So you can sympathize with them using this basis. I mean, how else are you going to prove to people that CO2 is a concern? But along the way, they never bothered to tell people that the land mattered too. And the phrase they use in science is land change. And I've heard that term used in your world too, which I really appreciate. Not everybody really notices that there's this category called land change that is part of this whole discussion. So that would be my first thing. I think we need to do some thought work and some explanation. We don't need to attack the IPCC, but the IPCC does need to explain itself. And what most people don't realize is when the IPCC was formed in the late 1980s, around 1986 to 88 was when it happened, they formed another organization called the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, the IGBP. And this organization was supposed to look at these other land-based living processes, water-based aspects to the climate. Only they were funded at 10% of the IPCC. They were largely ignored by the media, and in 2015 they were shut down. So I think there's a political motivation here too. I think the IPCC, which is an intergovernmental, not international, intergovernmental panel on climate change, is influenced by governments wanting, one, complete control of their land. They don't want international bodies talking about how they use their land, and they want to develop it. Governments always want to develop their land. And so we've been sold the narrative. I'm not going to trash it outright, but I think it's been politically motivated, economically motivated, and scientifically incomplete. It's like we have one eye closed. We're only looking at the physics, so we need to open up the biology eye.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. You know, you're talking about the IPCC Working Group 1, and a whole third of the focus of these reports is, yes, climate change is real, and they put so much energy in talking about what is coming. And it's like a third of it is adaptation, and this is always a product. Adaptation is a product, not sort of a systems solution.
Right.
It really struck me in AR6 when it stopped becoming systematic pathway and it turned into, okay, how many tons of CO2 per dollar are we going to get? It's a finite exchange of dollars to CO2 avoided, as if that's all it takes, enough money.
Yeah, and as if it was all CO2. You know, foresters are starting to openly complain about the CO2 only view of climate because, for instance, Antonio Nobre went to the Amazon 20 years ago to deal with climate. He's a famous Amazonian researcher. And I saw an interview with him and another scientist, and they both were talking about, oh yeah, when we got here 20 years ago, all we thought about was carbon. Now all we think about is water. is they had discovered that the power of a forest, climatically speaking, is hydrological. And when you damage the hydrology, then you damage its ability to absorb carbon too. So, and it's the same thing with soils. Soils that are healthy and full of living organisms are like a sponge. They can hold more water. And that reduces drought, it reduces desertification. It also allows them to absorb more water during floods. And it allows them to produce more life, which, allows them to actually create more water, because life is water held in living form. And what ecosystems do is they draw water from, various atmospheric currents, and they create their own hydrological systems of rain by releasing that vapor through evaporation into the sky, but they also release cloud condensation nuclei, the seed grains for future raindrops. So they're not only feeding the vapor to the cloud, they're feeding the means by which it can form raindrops, and that rain then falls elsewhere, which feeds other forests. So the forests are feeding each other. And sometimes they feed themselves. Sometimes the clouds rise and fall right back down. That's more typical, I think, the Amazon. But the point they were making is that it's these conveyors of water that largely affect what happens. And when you destroy land, you kind of destroy the conveyor belt. It's a very simplistic, it's a very complex matter. Rivers in the sky of vapor and so forth.
We have land use change in the IPCC reports. You're saying they're just not as well emphasized. Maybe they need a second look or a reprioritization. And do you think that their total impact on climate and the tipping points is being muted instead of giving its proper place? Do you think that perhaps we'll face worse CO2 feedback loops because of these constrained systems?
Yeah, I do think it is being muted. The last IPCC report gave approximately 4 pages to land change out of a 3,800-page document. And the text was beyond what average people are even going to understand. So there's a huge communication problem. And the IPCC did a special report on land in 2019, I believe. And I read it. And again, the land was treated as a recipient of climate change rather than a driver and a creator of climate. So it was the same old perspective of the downward pointing arrow. Basically what the IPCC was writing about was the effect on land of increased atmospheric CO2. So it's pretty much the same old message. What they weren't telling us was the effect on atmospheric CO2 of land being healthy or degraded, or the effect on regional, local, and global temperatures due to the cooling power of forests, whether they're degraded or healthy. So to me, the IPCC is somehow managed to bury something really critically important for us all to understand. And I'm not saying it's done with intention, but it's happened, and science can be hard to explain to lay people. So you got to give people a break. But yeah, I think they are diminishing.
Yeah, this reminds us of actually our guest last week was talking about the way that governments and markets are ignoring the human element in spaceflight. So we're trying to change carbon. We're not looking at how we address that change in carbon systematically.
Yeah, reducing it all to carbon rather than expanding it to the whole complexity, which is easy to do. It's human to do. We all want to do that, don't we? We want to reduce our problems to a single thing that makes it easier to solve heads, or seeming easier to solve. Certainly war and peace revolves around that. You have to reduce your enemy to a single evil. So we're good at this reduction business.
There's another thing to criticize, quote unquote, green energy from an environmental point of view. It's something like, if you do it, you're actually perceived as being an anti-environmentalist because you're just trying to jam up the works for nefarious reasons, I think.
Yeah, you
You know?
become a climate denier.
Yeah,
I've
you get
directly
mixed up with them.
I've directly confronted petro infrastructure and been hauled aboard Coast Guard boats going right at the source. So I don't think they can pin that on me.
Yeah,
I've
no, I
been there.
know, I know.
I've
I'm
fought
just
on the
making an
front lines.
observation about that.
No, I think you're right. And it's too bad that there's this on high kind of proper way that we're supposed to think about this. It's just not helpful, and it's tribal, and
Yes.
and we tend to leave the land out over and over in these conversations.
Yes, I mean it's very important. It's very important too. I mean, the whole thing about wind and solar farms and renewables, it's just propaganda. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but it's not renewable. We have critical shortages of minerals and everything that are involved in that.
Oh, they
And
would say the wind
also,
is renewable and solar is renewable because they're always
yeah,
there.
because the
That's
wind
the
is
thing.
free and the sun is free. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
ridiculous claim. It's a farm. These are industrial installations, a wind farm on the ocean. I mean,
Yeah.
people
Yeah. Right.
they
They're
just, you put
they're
that
big
farm in and
industry.
everybody thinks it's wonderful. Meanwhile, it's a
Yeah.
gigantic installation on the ocean, which I find to be pretty crude.
So I really like how you're concluding this is coming through. It is again emphasizing that it's more profitable to take over new land instead of trying to integrate these climate solutions into things like housing, parking, other places that have ready wind flow, but you're going to have to negotiate with your neighbors. If I put up a wind turbine too close to a city or too close to a small town, I'm going to have to negotiate with all those people. And so what are we doing? We're putting it where quote unquote no one lives, or where it's less popular to live, putting our climate solution in conflict with people, and that creates political problems of its own, of course.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing about fast tracking. If there is a robust permitting process, then people are forced to come up with the best solution. And if they're trying to plow up some desert for a solar array and people are opposed to that, then there's pressure to put it over parking lots or to put it on houses or figure some less invasive way to do that. But the green energy movement is promoting permitting reform, which takes away that very pressure. So it's unfortunate because all these things will require time and scientific review and lots of public process. And to think that you can just short end that. And the way it's being done, you've noticed the debt ceiling thing had permitting review in it. Are you aware of that? I don't know
Yeah.
the full details,
No.
but there is a section where what I have read is it's going to fast track the allowable length of time for the review process. So this seems to me highly undemocratic because it's a very touchy subject. It should be handled appropriately with hearings and lots of opportunity for public input. It should be a long process of people trying to figure this out, not done overnight, with a gun to the economy's head, as part of the debt ceiling. So I see
Yeah.
something less than democratic in this whole process. And,
Yeah.
this is coming from an organization that, from a group that tends to think of itself as defending democracy, right? So there's a lot of inconsistencies.
Right, but green is good. Get on the green train. We're gonna choo choo
Right.
go knock down
Yeah.
the forests and put up wind turbines and solar panels, and it'll be better? Question mark. I do appreciate that we do need to be cautious when it comes to this, and it's really sad.
Yeah. I spoke with a scientist in Spain. His name's Mian. He's 80 years old, And he was asked in 1991 by the European Commission to figure out why the summer storms in the Mediterranean basin were dying. They used to always have a late afternoon storm in the hillsides, and then those started to diminish. And eventually they just started to end completely, and rivers are drying up, farmers are abandoning their farms, and they were like, what is going on here? Can you figure it out? Well, what he did figure it out, and it was we were destroying the land. Because what happens in the Mediterranean, and we really are talking about climates. Climate is made of many climates, and they all operate according to geography, landforms, and also the living land and what it's doing. And in the Western Mediterranean basin, every morning a sea breeze would come in and would have a certain amount of moisture in it. And then in the old days, the Mediterranean, before we had cut all the trees and drained all the marshes, it was actually quite lush. They had great oak forests, they had massive marshlands. So this breeze would come in with, say, 40% of the moisture needed to form a future rain cloud, and then it would pick up the rest when it went over the marshes, and it would pick up more when it went over the great oaks. By the time it got high, at the back of the range and started to climb up the mountains, it had plenty of not only moisture, but cloud condensation nuclei provided by this vegetation to form these storms, which would release the heat higher into the atmosphere to advect away. The rain would fall, recharge the aquifers, and a kind of depleted air mass would return back over the Mediterranean. They filled the marshes due to industry and tourism, and they cut all the trees. And now the storms don't form because the breeze comes in and doesn't get the moisture, it just heats up. And what's worse, it then travels back over the Mediterranean. Now it's loaded with smog, water vapor, and it builds up in layers over the Mediterranean over the course of the summer and heats the basin, heats the water by about 2 degrees C. And that creates conditions for worsening storm events in the fall when certain storm tracks come down through the Mediterranean and then up into Central Europe. And when they do, and they come over this super saturated, warm water body with all these heavy, polluted, warm, and very humid masses of air, it ends up with extreme rain events in Central Europe. So it starts in one place and then expands outward from there. When we're talking about climate, we have to get away from these simple one-size-fits-all solution and figure out what is needed for each region that we live in. And every region has different patterns. And where I live in the Northwest, and I live in a climate that is totally modified from what it once was when we had giant, tall trees. Most of them have been cut down, and the Department of Natural Resources is trying to cut down the rest, and we have this idea that the forests are burning because CO2 in the air, and it doesn't help that the atmosphere is getting warmer, but the forests are burning because we're killing the forests.
Yeah.
When we replant a forest, we destroy the soil networks, we crush the soil with the machines, we actually spray the soil. So, and then we replant trees grown in nurseries that don't really have the knowledge that a seedling gets when it grows up in a forest through its relationships, its root and mycelial relationships with mother trees and the overall ecology that help the plants know how to behave, how to react to dry summers, how to react to cold summers. And they're just, a naturally grown forest is smarter, it's more resilient. They don't burn humidly planted forests. Even though they're trees and they do absorb carbon dioxide, they're not very well adapted. They're not very smart, and they're susceptible to insect infestation, and they tend to burn. So is the CO2 causing the forest fires, or is it forestry practice? And these questions don't even get asked. It's just assumed it's CO2. Everything's assumed to be CO2. And when you really dig under, you find that what we're doing to the land is often the more direct and immediate cause of the problem.
A singular bad guy is to blame for every problem we have. Needs to be pinned on a singular bad guy, not on our systems, not on the bad systems that we've built, but
right.
But you find a bad guy, PG&E and the dangling hooks that are wearing out, and now the bad guy's infrastructure. So spread the money for infrastructure that'll solve all problems. You can shotgun trees into the side of the Amazon, and it'll be all right, right? It'll be all right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's easier narrative to. We hear this concerning renewables and everything, that we'll have this interconnectivity. We'll get the wind from Maine, and then we'll have the lines, and it'll bring that power down to Virginia and all of that. I don't know if I've ever heard of any of these lines that have ever been permitted. And I'm wondering, maybe I'm wrong. And also, what if they did it, what would that look like ecologically?
Well, yeah, so that's one of the big pushes for permitting reform and fast tracking, is these things are very hard to permit, and partly it's because they go through numerous states, so each state has its own process. You know, you have this situation where, let's take a forested region, say you cut a wide swath through a state's forests in order to run this electricity. Theoretically, you're helping the global climate, but you're doing immediate damage to the local climate by cutting those trees, because those trees were helping to cool the climate. They're helping to keep the soil cool so it didn't burn off its carbon. So it's kind of like you're robbing Peter to pay Paul to a certain degree. I don't know if it's, 1 and 1. I don't know how the math would actually play out. It would take a lot of figuring, but it's an existential reality that people are being asked to sacrifice their local climates for the sake of the global climate, but they're not being told that. And no one is realizing that. And if people realize that this infrastructure is going to actually damage our own local climate, they might have a different take on the technology. Plus, we're killing animals that are struggling to survive, or, animals need homes, and they need functional homes. Like, I don't know if, have you guys ever walked in a managed forest plantation, tree plantation, and seen kind of what they're like?
Dirt bike trails, yeah.
Yeah, there's skinny trees really packed close together. There's not a lot that's going to be able to live in a forest like that. Whereas if you have an older forest that's naturally regrown, you'll see lots of different levels of trees and canopy. You'll see fallen logs. And if you go through a forest like that, you see the evidence of life. You see the burrows, you see little chips of wood where birds have been, pecking at rotted trees. So these are other, points that aren't being raised. For me, the obvious thing is to do least harm. So, and that's what you need a permitting process for, because that's where the citizens can come in and they can say, hey, no, this is an older forest and we're not going to let you put a transmission line through it. Unless, of course, you take away that ability, which seems to be happening.
Speaking of homes for animals, homes for people, we recently had this permitting reform for multifamily housing in Washington state. And now I'm thinking, what else slipped through in that permitting reform? Was there we need housing, so, people who live next to the golf course don't get to complain about the new apartment building. But at the same time, maybe we still need a process of control if we're talking about large industrial projects. And as Gabe correctly pointed out, these are large industrial projects, whether it's a transmission line, a wind turbine, a dam, a solar farm. It is a singular feature that displaces a large amount of wild space. And here at the Ecomodernist Society, wild space is one of our emphases. And as you're giving us all of this wonderful knowledge, wild spaces are very effective self-managing tools to protect our climate, to protect biodiversity. And so this question is going to bother me all day. Have we let something slip through in Washington state with our permitting reform that deals with gray or brownfield space? That is space already destroyed by human habitation, and using that land better. That should be the place where we smooth clear the path and allow, yes, anyone can put up solar panels on top of your home. We already pay people to do it, but letting people obstruct that for any reason seems a little silly to me. So all of these permitting reform discussions need to be focused, I think, on that wild space versus gray field, brown field space.
Yeah, well, one way to think about wild space is also planetary intelligence. I mean, these are the only places that maintain the original biotic intelligence of planetary evolution. In the oceans, 3.8 billion years, and on land, hundreds of millions of years. I mean, that's a kind of knowledge that we can't even grasp. And these are systems that we don't fully understand. So, yeah, the way I kind of break it down in kind of rules is first save wilderness. That has to be the first primary goal. Is we need to understand these places they're lifeboats of planetary intelligence that we can't lose, and then restore the damaged places. Like you say, I think there's so much potential. It's almost like the Earth is giving us a second gift. First, it just gave us the gift of its bounty, which we took and destroyed, leaving wastelands and deserts. But now it's saying, well, come back and restore me. Bring the animals back onto the land and run them properly so they are working within the ecosystem, not against it, and helping to bring back biodiversity. Bring agriculture and animal husbandry back together because they need each other. And there's just so much potential when we think of the amount of land we've damaged around the world to restore that land. One of the things I've become interested in is what's called the new water paradigm. Have you heard of that?
I've missed that.
Okay. The new water paradigm was produced by scientists in Czechoslovakia and Estonia, what we would think of as Eastern European countries. And, they place that water at the center of climate. And their approach is to basically hold water on the land. And when you do that, the land begins to hold more water on its own because you have more trees to grab the water and bring it down, and requires a certain amount of human labor. So there's an opportunity for work. Going out into these ruined landscapes and making these small, tiny check dams in the throats of little ravines, building small reservoirs, and bringing the water back on the land, which brings the life back to the land. And at the same time,
you're mimicking
sequesters more carbon.
Yeah.
So that would be the second thing. Yeah. Save wilderness, restore land. And then whatever technologies we use, I think they should be those that provide the least harm. I'm not totally well read on the technologies myself, but that should be the test to me. What is doing the least harm? And that's a complicated question.
I really love to talk about this one. Understanding the least harm, it is like medicine. It's anything you do is a medical intervention. We're performing surgery on our planet. We are doing a medical intervention. We're putting up transmission lines and windmills or deploying nuclear plants. Whichever you choose, both of those are less harmful, of course, than fossil fuels. And perhaps the most frustrating thing at a clean energy conference, I was arguing with the one guy who didn't like the nuclear booth at this conference, and he was saying, "Well, coal, you don't have this problem, but coal, you have a much bigger problem. You have carbon dioxide, particulate matter. You have horrible outcomes. So coal is
Oh my
this
God.
literally smoking and destroying our planet. And maybe
Oh
there's
my
ways
God.
of
What?
getting off. Yeah, yeah. It was a bizarre conversation, but there
Very
there are
bizarre.
a number of solutions, and there's one sure way. If we killed 8 or 7.5 billion people, that would calm down our energy use and wilderness would come back. But I don't want to do that. I like people. I
Yeah, it's
really
kind of
like to
harsh.
have people on this planet. I think it'd be fantastic if we could survive. And so we need to find the right intervention that will let our patient, the planet Earth, survive.
Yeah, it's a good way
Yeah.
to put it. And I like that you're using medical terminology, which I think is appropriate. If you think of the climate as a living system, then you have a living being. And
Yeah.
and there's a
Yeah.
lot of science for thinking of it that way. It's not just some hippie concept, it's science too. I
Yeah.
mean, it's called Gaian science in some circles, but it's also global system science. You don't have to use the term Gaia if that bothers people, but
Yeah. Well, you say global system science. I mean, is there a whole area of science that's a specialty involved with that?
yeah, so the Gaia hypothesis by James Lovelock is pretty hard to refute, and people argue around the edges of it, but it's not a term scientists are going to want to embrace. And in fact, he did not want to use that term. A friend of his convinced him that it would be more poetic. So when science basically approaches the Gaian idea, it's, I believe, called global systems research. And it's the idea of the planet as a singular operating system, like a human body, that regulates itself and takes care of itself, which makes perfect sense when you think about how long the planet has been at this, for how many billions of years. Say, if you were to take life off the planet and look at the climate, it would be nothing like what we have. So you have to give life its due as, I think,
Yeah.
as the author and orchestrator of climate.
Yeah.
And this is,
We're part of the
yeah.
natural world.
Okay. I want to riff on that a little bit. So in this global systems, we were trying to break away from that singular metric, like the almighty
Mm-hmm.
dollar or the almighty carbon ton. Those
Yeah.
are dominating the conversation. And a systems research or a systems analysis that deals with carbon, water, nitrogen, all sorts of, what are the other possible systems that really need to be addressed in an analysis like this?
Yes, in how they move around the planet, how they move around localities. It's a huge area of research. The IGBP, which I referenced earlier, the International Biosphere Program, which produced a magazine called Global Change, had some amazing research. And they created the planetary boundaries concept, which many people use. But it just wasn't treated as serious as the carbon physics. In some ways, this has been going on in science for a while. I remember when I was in college long ago, physics was considered the hard science and biology was the soft science. And Bill McKibben loves to say you can't argue with the physics, which is true, but you can't argue with biology either. In fact, we wouldn't even be here arguing without biology. So you can get metaphysical about it and you get poetic about it, but those are also important ways of seeing and knowing.
Yeah. So
Go
tell
ahead,
us
James.
about your blog. That's related to this, I guess,
Yeah,
or not?
yeah, it's called The Climate According to
Okay.
Life. And I was having trouble getting anybody to publish my writings on this or even to be interested. I would send out queries and get no reply. And then I heard about Substack and the fact that there's no censorship on Substack and the fact that you own your material. And I thought, okay, let's give this a try. So I started this Substack page, and it's very small. I have 99 subscribers. Oh, I think I have 102 subscribers. What's really nice for a writer and for you, anybody trying to get an idea out, is when you have a schedule and you have a system and you just start going, and every week you produce something, then you build a body of work. And I need that kind of push. And that's a good way to approach writing, keep it simple.
That's a good way. It's true. A lot of times we assume people know more than they do when we speak.
Yeah.
So we got to be careful for that. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So any closing thoughts?
Can I read you a poem?
Please.
Sure.
This is a cloud I saw in Southwest Washington that just appealed to me, and I wrote about it, and people seem to like the poem. So, the cloud. There were many others above, pale gray dirigibles beneath slate gray stratus. One, though, had dropped down, catching the sun's last molten exhalations. Brass, then copper wool unraveled out of and into itself, a slowly rolling tumbleweed of mist and fire, somersaulting beneath the others, which hung like carp in a pool. Surely something so centralist, whose excellence is in coming apart, who arrives by dissolving, has no object or intention. It does not reach like a branch or a thought, and in the entire arc of its existence never fully coheres. Yet still I address it in the personal, as whom, and make strange promises. We will turn one day, I say. We will love this place again.
Very nice.
My cloud poem.
This has been a great talk with Rob Lewis. He authored the article. You can find it on resilience.org. Fast Tracking Extinction, the rush to streamline permitting for green energy. He's writing a substack, Climate According to Life, and also the book, The Silence of Vanishing Things. Thanks so much for joining us. And remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.